Welcome to a very special episode of the Downtown Den Politics with me, Frank McKenna. Today I'm joined by the former chairman of the very influential Conservative Backbench 1922 Committee, Sir Graham Brady. Sir Graham was in Parliament for 25 years. He's recently written a book reflecting on his quarter of a century as a parliamentarian. And of course, in that key role as chairman of the 1922, he saw off many a Conservative Prime Minister as the letters of no confidence, of course, were delivered to him, and he then had to trot off to 10 Downing Street to tell the sitting Prime Minister of the time that their time was up. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation. Delighted that Sir Graham Brady has joined us. Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
I'm absolutely delighted to be joined in the Downtown Den by Sir Graham Brady. As I mentioned in the introduction, a quarter of a century in Westminster, a book that is best-selling called Kingmaker, absolutely fascinating and entertaining read. And we're going to talk about Graham's time in Parliament, his experiences, his reflections, obviously look at some of the key things that happened during that quarter of a century during his time as a parliamentarian. He's lived through a financial crash during that time. We then had Brexit, of course, the pandemic, Liz Truss. Be interested to see which of those he thinks has been the most challenging for the country. But also, of course, chairman of that very influential Conservative Backbench Committee, the 1922 committee. So, Sir Graham, welcome to the Downtown Den. Thanks for being with us today.
Pleasure to be with you, Frank.
Yeah. So let's start back in 1997 when you were elected as the youngest Conservative Member of Parliament in that particular intake. But of course, it wasn't a particularly good year for you Tories, because that saw a landslide victory for Tony Blair. John Major's government went out in a puff of smoke, and really I don't think John Major ever really recovered, did he, from the ERM debacle back in 1993. When you came into Parliament, 97, Blair, this new shiny Prime Minister who was more popular than John Lennon and Paul McCartney at the height of their popularity, I think. Did you expect to be in opposition for as long as you were subsequently?
No, I didn't. And, I suppose maybe that's one of the benefits of being young. I was much more optimistic than that. And I could see a Labour government, which I didn't think was achieving very much. And, in many ways, the biggest achievement of the first term of Tony Blair was to keep to the promise not to increase tax or national insurance. Essentially, the Labour's promised that they would hold to the previous Conservative government's tax and spending plans ensured a period of rigorous fiscal control, which, as Ken Clarke, the previous Tory Chancellor, subsequently said, well, they kept to our spending plans, but we probably wouldn't have. So it was a really tough period of control of public spending, which set the country fair. And, of course, there was also, nobody quite understood why at the time. It was driven mostly by a lot of money coming in from China and driving low interest rates and low inflation, and everything seemed very, very benign for those first few years. But it wasn't clear to me what it was the Blair-Brown partnership was delivering as a part of that. It seemed like continuity of what had gone before.
Well, they inherited a really strong economy, ironically, didn't they? I think it was 18 years of Conservative rule prior to that. So there does come a time when the country simply thinks it's time for a change. But Blair did seem to get the zeitgeist of the country at the time as well. There was all that cool Britannia, if we remember at the time, and that modernity that he'd introduced into the Labour Party. So a strong economic inheritance, but also, I guess, a very charismatic sort of leader. What did you make of Tony Blair and indeed subsequently Gordon Brown when he became Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, you're right. Obviously, Tony Blair was immensely popular at the start, and it went on throughout that first Parliament, which is quite a remarkable outcome. And I must say that whilst I didn't ever really warm to him, because I thought that he was a little bit too casual with the truth. I think it was Paddy Ashdown who said, came to realise that Tony Blair believed what he was saying when he was saying it. And I think there's probably a lot of truth in that. But huge contrast between the circumstances now, Labour coming into government with a landslide and throwing Conservative government out, reduced to a very small number of MPs in Parliament. All of that's similar. But Tony Blair maintained huge popularity throughout the Parliament. And Keir Starmer never really had it even at the start. And certainly a year in, it's looking pretty bleak.
So in terms of, we go through that period to say up until the financial crash, I guess, 2008, where Labour were very much still in the ascendancy and you're on the opposition benches. Incrementally, the Conservatives are getting more seats and becoming stronger in opposition. My reflections on that period of time is it wasn't really until Michael Howard took the leadership of the Conservative Party, became leader of the opposition, that they started to begin to look like a serious opposition and potentially a government once again. Of course, 2008 came, and once that had happened, I think it was set fair then for the Tories to take power once again. And by this point, David Cameron has become Prime Minister. Were you a supporter of Cameron?
I was a supporter of Cameron once he became our leader, and I was keen for him to succeed and win an election and become Prime Minister. But I'd supported the other candidate, David Davis, very strongly. I thought probably reflected more my kind of conservatism, which is probably a little bit more muscular and a little bit more direct than what David Cameron was doing, which was clearly pitching to Lib Dems and Greens and just trying to rebrand the Conservative Party and change its image. But I was very keen for the whole thing to work, although in 2007 I had a sort of significant turning point in my career. I'd been trying to climb the greasy pole for the previous 10 years. I was doing quite successfully. I'd been Michael Howard's PPS when he was leader of the opposition. He then made me Shadow Europe Minister, which is always quite a key post in the Conservative Party, given the difficulties in our debates about the European Union. So I was loving that job. I believed in what I was doing. I was very happy doing it. And then we saw David Willetts, the then Shadow Education Secretary, making a speech in which he started attacking grammar schools, which I'd been for 10 years probably the most outspoken advocate of grammar schools in Parliament. I represented 4 great state grammar schools in Altrincham and Sale West, including my own old school, Altrincham Boys. So there was no way that I could just accept that our policy was turning through 180 degrees overnight. I had to speak out, and it ended up with a choice. I could carry on speaking out and cease being Shadow Europe Minister, or I could stop speaking out and carry on as Shadow Europe Minister. And I don't have any regrets about choosing what I think was the right course and speaking up for some of the best schools in the country and a system of education that I think can offer real opportunities for social mobility to people.
How often do you think politicians take the alternative view in that sort of circumstance, in that situation where they have vehemently opposed the view that's being expressed by the Prime Minister or the leader of the opposition in the position you were in, or the Shadow Minister for Education, of course, as Willetts was, but they think, bite my tongue, because actually I need to stay on track, I need to stay in this lane of personal progression. Do you think most politicians would actually take the alternative route to the one that you decided to take?
Yes, and most of the time, I think, but I don't say that with any immediate note of criticism for the individual choices that are made. I think it's something which is inherent in our system of government, the parliamentary system of government, where essentially the whole thing only really works if you have collective responsibility, and that once the team has decided its policy position, everybody has to accept it and go along with it. And so I think the pernicious thing is that it might start with some tiny little thing, something you think, well, that's wrong, I don't agree with that, but that's the position the team has taken, and okay, I'll go with it because it doesn't really matter that much to me. And then maybe a little bit later there's something which is a bit bigger, and you think, God, why on earth are they doing that? I've got to swallow hard to go on television or on the radio and defend the new line on this. But it's my job, and I'm a loyal member of the team. And then you reach the thing which is absolutely central to why you're there. And for me, I joined the Conservative Party to campaign to keep my grammar school when the other parties wanted to close it. So it was so fundamental for me, and I'd spent 10 years making the argument in Parliament, and I just thought, well, if I don't make a stand on this, what am I going to make a stand on? And it was very striking, actually. David Miliband, who, when he was Shadow Schools Minister a few years before that, I'd shadowed him. And just after I'd resigned, he bumped into me in the Commons corridor. And he said, Graham, I just wanted to let you know you did exactly the right thing. He said, I've had a team of researchers pulling out everything you ever said about grammar schools over the last 10 years. And all I can say is that if you hadn't have resigned, nobody would ever have taken you seriously again. So there was a moment when you've got to make that call. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing, because certainly at the time, I thought it was probably the end of my political career, and I was contemplating not standing again at the next general election. I was really quite profoundly miserable about it, but I was also confident I'd done the right thing, and I think the reaction from colleagues and from the public bore that out.
And ironically, I think I'm right in saying the Labour Party never closed a grammar school in its time in office, and I'm sure David Miliband, at least privately, was very supportive of the position you'd taken.
I don't know. We never had that conversation. Only across
I probably know David better than you. Yeah. So you're saying at that point that you're considering whether or not to stand at the next election. So what time are we talking about here, Graham? Cameron's become leader by this point. Yeah.
May 2007.
Yeah.
Then it's an all-consuming thing. If you're a busy member of the front bench in opposition or in government, you're wrapped up in it, you're doing media, you're travelling, you're making speeches, and then suddenly you step away from it. And there's a kind of deafening silence. And I remember perhaps a good illustration of it. At that point, the Chinese had obviously decided that I was a sort of rising star, an important shadow foreign minister, and they were arranging a visit to China. Essentially, for me, they were doing it around me, around my timetable. I think there would have been other people coming along as well. But we'd fixed the dates. And then after I resigned from the front bench, I thought, well, this is getting closer. And I called or messaged the contact of the embassy and I said, I haven't heard anything from you for a while. And it became apparent that this was something they were doing for the Shadow Europe minister. They weren't doing it for me. I think maybe in Chinese politics, if you walk away from the party, you've walked away full stop. But I always remember that being a sort of very vivid illustration of the change in my position and my status. And I was looking for something useful to do, really. And as it happened, because of the little reshuffle that followed my resignation, there was a gap on the Treasury State Committee. And I thought, well, that'll be interesting, useful, I'll learn things. I thought it'd probably be really very, very dull. But actually, that couldn't have been further from the truth, because essentially my first substantive meeting that I attended, we had Mervyn King, the Governor of the Bank of England, coming to a longer range to talk about the quarterly inflation report. But it happened to be the Monday, or I think it was, after the Northern Rock had collapsed at the weekend. So it was a fascinating period, and those sort of two and a half years up to the 2010 general election, and one of those rare moments where the complex matters of banking regulation and sort of tripartite regimes in the city and so on, which mostly are fairly esoteric specialist subject. I go and speak at a ladies' luncheon in the Lake District, and people were coming up to me and saying, "Oh, I saw the question that you asked on Tuesday afternoon. I was very interested in the response." And I think the committee was playing a really important role in trying to open up a kind of layman's view of something that people across the country were really very worried about, but didn't really feel they understood. So we actually had some proper box office figures for some very dry evidence sessions about banking regulation.
Yeah, it's a great demonstration, actually, Graham, isn't it, of how quickly things can turn in politics. So you can feel 1 minute it's a brutal thing, this, and wondering whether or not to bother standing again. All of a sudden you're thrown back into the limelight because of global circumstances in respect of the financial situation, the financial crisis. And that, of course, brings us to the 2010 election, where I think most commentators were predicting that David Cameron would become Prime Minister. Polls demonstrated the case, although I would say that I thought Gordon Brown managed the crisis well. Brought world leaders together, came up with rescue packages and so on and so forth. But I think for all sorts of reasons, again, partly, I guess, because people were ready for a change, David Cameron, as I say, certainly favourite to win that election. But surprisingly, certainly to me at the time, didn't get an overall majority. And I just wondered two things from your perspective. One, whether you thought that was a bit disappointing, or am I being a bit harsh when I say he should have achieved an overall majority? And then secondly, and take account of something you've said in your book in terms of why you thought Brexit was won in terms of the Leave campaign, the deal he did with Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say I agree with your assessment about Gordon Brown. I thought actually for first, 12 years or so that I was in Parliament, Gordon Brown was seen as an all-conquering chancellor, and then when he was Prime Minister, a lot of people said, "Oh no, he's been hopeless." Actually, I always thought it was the other way around. I thought as chancellor, once that first term had passed and they turned the spending taps on again, then I think Gordon Brown actually built up some of the dangerous background that made it harder to weather the banking crisis when it came, because we were more in debt and there was less room for manoeuvre for government. But then, as you say, as Prime Minister, I think he got hold of the crisis and mobilised opinion. It was summed up in that unfortunate slip in the House of Commons, where Gordon Brown said that he'd been busy saving the world. But he had done an impressive and important job, and probably was very important in holding the global financial system together at that point. But it was really very instructive for quite a long period. The Conservative Party had a fairly strong lead in the polls, and it did look inevitable that we were going to form a government, that David Cameron was going to become Prime Minister. But it all started just as the campaign was getting underway. It started to slip away. And I think there was just a kind of nagging sense in the public mind that maybe we weren't standing for what we needed to stand for, and perhaps we were a little bit too keen to be like the government that had gone before. And then we had that bizarre period during the campaign that became known as Clegg Mania, where because Nick Clegg was unknown, everybody said, "Oh, this guy is marvellous." But that then reset before the election. Lib Dem support fell back to broadly where it was before all that happened. But at the end of it, we were left with people with some doubts and less certain they wanted a Conservative government. And the formation of the coalition government, in my view, was an error. And I said at the time, I thought we should have gone for a period of minority government. It might only have been 6 months. I think an autumn election following it would have been quite likely. But I think that would have been an election we would have been in a strong position to win outright. But going for the coalition, the point I make in the book is that I think in a funny way, the coalition of the Liberal Democrats made the EU referendum almost inevitable and made the outcome of us leaving more likely. And that's because our previous policy position had always been to seek an incremental return of powers and competencies from the EU to Britain to rebalance the relationship. And I think if we'd been able to do that, we might have reached a point where, broadly speaking, the British public would have been happy with where we were. But as it was, the Liberal Democrats in the coalition wouldn't allow that conversation to happen. I wouldn't allow any effort at renegotiation of the relationship. So all David Cameron was left with to promise to his own backbenchers and also to fight off the pesky UKIP challenge that was starting to become an issue was to say, we will have an in or out referendum in the next parliament. And I've always suspected that he thought that he would never be in a position to deliver it because he thought he would be back in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. But those funny little quirks of fate where on election night in 2015, where it emerged that we had secured a narrow majority as the Conservative Party alone.
Yeah, I totally agree with your analysis. I'm sure that David Cameron and indeed George Osborne thought they would be going into another coalition and therefore the Liberal Democrats would save them from the prospect of having to deliver that promise on a referendum. Nevertheless, the timing of that referendum probably comes back to haunt Cameron on, if not a daily basis, a weekly basis, because there was no need for him to go as soon as 2016. He had that period in front of him where he could have continued as Prime Minister and perhaps chosen a better time for himself and the government. But he was confident he was going to win, Graham. He won the Scottish referendum. He then delivered the first Conservative majority since 1992. He must have felt he was on a roll. As you went into that referendum campaign, what was your feeling? Did you think, as most of the country did, we're not going to roll the dice here? People don't necessarily go and vote for change. We'll probably stay in the European Union.
Well, as I say, I spent some time as Shadow Europe Minister, and my instinct was very much to go with our policy of incremental return of powers. Now, being honest, I probably would have wanted to carry on returning powers to national control until there was probably not very much left at an EU level. But I was always much more naturally easy with that approach for precisely the reason that if you have a referendum, first of all, there is an inherent bias. People almost always vote for the status quo because people are quite naturally small c conservative, don't want to take risks, which I think incidentally means that the 52-48 result in favour of change was actually an amazing achievement because normally people cleave to the existing situation. But so I would have been inclined to avoid a referendum from that point of view, partly because I thought it was more likely that people would vote Remain. And the trouble with the European Union, one of the problems of the European Union, is it wasn't ever a static thing. It was in constant evolution and essentially constantly seeking more integration, seeking to build more powers at the centre. And I feared very much that it was quite likely there would have been a vote. And I feared that if that happened, it would have been taken as a green light for much more integration. And so, I was quite worried. But, in many ways, that's one of the reasons why I pitched myself into trying to persuade people to vote Leave, which I didn't do an awful lot in the media, a little bit, but I did quite a lot of meetings around the country, debates in universities, speaking in school sixth forms, investor groups, whatever it might be, and it was a very interesting experience. And as I did that, I started to think. I think probably about 3 weeks out, I started to think, actually, I think we're going to vote to leave, and it was for two reasons really. The general one was that whatever group I'd spoken to. I remember the first big meeting I did was about 200 or 300 people from the insurance sector in the City of London. It was a breakfast meeting, and everybody had said to me, "Oh, insurance, they're all like Europe. You'll have a rotten time. Nobody will agree with you." And over bacon sandwiches and coffee before I started, I had a queue of people coming up to me to say, "Just wanted to let you know, we're 110% on your side. We won't be saying that later because we have a corporate position as well." And so everything that I did, even if it was a group of people who are likely to be really quite positive about EU membership, there was a big minority, maybe 30, maybe 40%, who were saying, "Oh no, I'm going to vote Leave." A lot of people said farmers benefited a lot from the Common Agricultural Policy and all those successor schemes that were in place. But I didn't have a lot of farmers in my constituency. I remember going to meet with them, and a couple of the guys saying, "Oh yeah, this is going to cost me money, but I'm damn well voting for it." And there was a real sense that it was a moment, and possibly the only moment, when people would be able to stop the juggernaut that was going in a direction they didn't like.
Interesting. I'll come back a little later to whether you think Brexit has been a success or not. But let me then move on to the election result. The referendum, as you say, went in way of Leave, and David Cameron resigns. There's then some momentum built around Boris Johnson, and a lot of people were expecting Boris to become Prime Minister at that time. We ended up, of course, with, I think it was Michael Gove who initially said he was going to back Boris and then decided he was going to stand himself. Wheels came off Boris's campaign. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's right. But anyway, we end up with Theresa May, because Andrea Leadsom, who was the opponent to Theresa May from memory, her campaign got into some difficulties. She decides to stand aside. Am I right in my recollection, Graham? Theresa was basically elected unopposed.
Yes, and Theresa. I mean, it's interesting. A number of people say, "If only there'd been a contest," but actually, I was going to be the returning officer in the election, so I couldn't say who I might favour. But I'd asked my own Conservative Association to let me know their thoughts. Now, 500 or so members, I think I had 150 or 200 replies, and they were 75% for Theresa May. And I think that a lot of people thought having somebody who had the amount of experience she had in government, she'd been at the Home Office for a long time, the fact that she seemed very steady and down to earth at a time when there was some uncertainty, I think people liked that. And I think also a lot of people thought, as somebody who'd campaigned gently to Remain, but had then fully accepted the democratic instruction from the electorate to take us out of the EU, that in many ways that was exactly what was needed, to have somebody who could say, well, I voted to remain myself, but we have a duty to implement the referendum result. So I think there are all sorts of things coming together for Theresa. And, Andrea, I know she had an unfortunate interview in the Times, which came just before her decision to step down. But I was always at pains to point out that actually she'd been to see me before the interview took place to say that she was thinking of pulling out of the contest. And the reason was that she'd only secured a third of the, or 30% it might have been, but it might have been a third of the support amongst MPs in the final ballot. And she was concerned that she could end up winning votes of the party members, but without the support of the parliamentary party. So, and she was concerned, I think, as well, that if she got into a lengthy leadership election over that summer, there was every potential for some economic market turbulence, which might have caused the country harm. So I think she was already thinking very seriously about pulling out before the interview took place, and for entirely selfless and altruistic reasons.
When you look back at the time that Theresa May was Prime Minister, Graham, and obviously by this time you've been installed as the chairman of the 1922 committee, of course, she made that fatal error, as it transpired, of calling the general election way ahead in the polls, of course, but then I think by common consent, one of the worst Conservative campaigns ever seen, and up against, let's face it, one of the worst Labour Party leaders in modern times in Jeremy Corbyn, then fails to deliver a majority. At what point did you feel, listening to, talking to your backbenchers, obviously with this big piece of legislation to try and get through the Commons in terms of Brexit, at what point did you think her premiership was in trouble?
Well, I mean, her premiership was clearly going to be a difficult one because we had a small majority already, and we had a very big and difficult thing to deliver, which was withdrawal from the European Union. And there was a small but significant group on the Conservative backbenches who, whilst they had said that they were in favour of following the outcome of the referendum, were actually prepared to do almost anything they could, working often with the Labour Party and others, to try to stop it happening. So it was going to be hellishly difficult from the start. Once she had the 2017 election and lost our majority, and only managed to sustain the government in office with the confidence and supply arrangement with the Democratic Unionists from Northern Ireland, what had been difficult was going to be transferred into being nigh on impossible. And I guess most of us knew that things were going to continue to be very, very hard to deliver. But there was always the hope that we would just reach the point where there would be a sensible withdrawal agreement on the table, and that people would say, yeah, we've got to do it, even if they didn't like it themselves. Instead, what happened was we had a withdrawal agreement brought forward, which was obviously unacceptable. And, I tell the story in a book that I heard on the BBC radio, the reports of what was going to be agreed. And it was obviously very well briefed because of the detail of it. And I got in touch and said, can I come and see Theresa? And I went and sat with her and said, I just wanted to tell you there's no way, if these are accurate reports, there's no earthly way this can get a majority in the House of Commons. And she looked completely shocked by that, and said, well, let me send my Europe advisors to your office and take you through it. And they came with a little flip chart, and every page they turned, I thought, my God, this is worse than I thought. And it was clearly just not going to fly. And so I had another meeting with her, where she also brought the chief whip in, Jefferson Smith, and I said, this will not get a majority in the House of Commons. And of course, she ended up delaying putting it before the House of Commons. But the idea of the delay was to try to get some improvements. But instead, she ended up then putting exactly the same thing in front of the House of Commons. And it was defeated by the biggest majority that any government has ever been defeated by in the House of Commons. And then we had several other attempts to get it through. And the effort that I made to try to remove the most difficult stumbling block, which was the so-called Northern Irish backstop, and tabled what became quite widely known as the Brady Amendment, which was to approve the withdrawal agreement, but without the backstop or something called the political declaration, and with alternative arrangements at the Irish border. And that was the only positive proposition related to Brexit that achieved a majority in the House of Commons in that Parliament. But as I tell in the book, that the day of the vote, we had a big meeting of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, which I was chairing. Theresa was speaking to the colleagues, and she, in response to a question, said, and that's why I've asked the party to be whipped to support Graham's amendment. So the party supported it, the front bench supported it, and we won the vote. But of course, then just a few days later, I flicked on the evening news in my office, and there was Theresa on a visit to Belfast, and somebody said, "And Prime Minister, what do you think about the Northern Irish backstop?" To which she replied, "Oh, we want to keep the backstop." Which was a sort of head in hands moment where I sent a text to her just saying, "Theresa, I've just seen you on live television saying you want to keep the backstop. Can I remind you that it's only 5 days since you whipped the party to support my amendment, which said the exact opposite?" I didn't get a reply to my text.
And people will remember well the turbulent time in Parliament, and probably the time, Graham, that an awful lot of people who don't necessarily follow politics closely, but were looking at Westminster thinking, we just can't have this chaos continuing. And inevitably the time comes when you do get the requisite number of letters of no confidence, and you have to go and see the Prime Minister to tell her the time is up. What was that conversation like? And was she almost feeling that that was an inevitability in terms of the way things had gone for her?
I had a series of conversations. I think there were probably 3. And I think that things moved. But first conversation, I thought she was felt quite aggrieved. I think she thought she'd done everything that she possibly could to make the withdrawal agreement work, and that it was others who were getting in the way. I think then events continued to turn and things got even worse. And essentially it was the point where we fought the European Parliament election just a few weeks before we were technically meant to be leaving the EU altogether. And I think the British public took a dim view of this because it just didn't seem straight. It didn't seem like we meant what we were saying we were going to do. And the Conservative Party secured 9% in a national vote, which was a pretty dismal outcome, and was, I think, bound to make Conservative colleagues in the House of Commons more and more nervous about what the outcome of the next election might be. So I think at that point, it became obvious to most colleagues that Theresa just could not hold things together and couldn't therefore stay. And during those few months, there'd been a growing pressure for the 1922 Committee to change its rules. And instead of saying, once you've had a confidence vote and you've won it, you can't face another one for 12 months, that we should drop that 12-month suspension and say there could be another one, much shorter timescale. And a number of us, even if we thought that probably Theresa couldn't recover from where she was, a number of us were quite reluctant to change those rules because it seemed like changing the rules while the game had already started, and just didn't seem. I think it might have seemed like there was a even greater chaos and lack of certainty. And after the European Parliament election, I think the 1922 executive, I thought it had obviously by that point shifted to the point where it would support that rule change. But we managed to get sort of slightly bizarre agreement that instead of changing the rules, we'd hold a vote on whether to change the rules. But I wouldn't count the results of the vote. It would be kept sealed in an envelope. But I would only open if, when I went to see Theresa again, I couldn't persuade her to give a date for her departure. And I still have the sealed envelope because Theresa did give a date for her departure. But I mean, it was a difficult, fraught time, and I think probably for everyone in Parliament on whichever side of the debate, the stasis that we had, where the public wanted some resolution. A lot of people, I don't think, cared which resolution it was, but they wanted us to move on. And Parliament was simply incapable of agreeing on anything apart from the Brady Amendment. So it became really painful, and I think certainly in my time in the House of Commons, by far the worst period.
Yeah, and I think an awful lot of MPs who experienced that period of time would say exactly the same, Graham. We move on then, of course, to Boris Johnson's premiership. He goes through a Conservative Party leadership contest, of course, wins quite comfortably in the end. I think he was a runoff eventually with Jeremy Hunt. Then fights a general election with that slogan, "Get Brexit Done," and clearly Brexit was done. But I want to talk about Boris Johnson's period in office in terms of the time during the pandemic, because you and I had a conversation. You may not recall this because I'm sure you did many interviews during that period of time, but we had a conversation where you were raising some very serious concerns about the approach we were taking to the pandemic, particular lockdowns. And I'll remind you of three of the things that you were expressing concern over. One was the impact on young people. Secondly, the impact on mental health. And thirdly, the impact on the economy. In each case, you've been proved right. Were you having those conversations quite forcibly at the time with the Prime Minister and others? And there's a great story in the book, if I could just remind you of this, I'm sure you don't need reminding, on Boris's comment over the 2-metre rule. So perhaps you can, in your comments about the pandemic, sort of relate to that comment that Boris Johnson made as well.
I mean, I think when we got the news starting to come in about COVID, obviously nobody was quite sure how bad it was, how many people would die, and I thought that the idea, extreme as it was, the idea of a 3-week lockdown where people would be strongly encouraged not to mix at all outside their own homes, and all of those restrictions, which it's hard to believe now with hindsight, but you remember queuing outside supermarkets and a certain number of people were allowed in at a time, and there were so many more. But it did seem to me that the House of Commons had allowed the government its emergency legislation to allow for that 3-week lockdown, with a kind of an expectation that there would be an effort to get life back to something more normal as soon as possible. And again, I started off with a fairly sort of moderate sense of, okay, so when's this going to happen? And you'll recall it was a gloriously sunny spring, which I think is one of the reasons that people put up with the restrictions. But I can remember having been to the Tesco store in Altrincham, my constituency, and seeing that I could go, as well as buying groceries, I could buy a bunch of flowers there. But the stall at Altrincham Market, where we normally would buy flowers, had been forced to close.
Yeah.
And I mean, it seemed so obviously counterintuitive. An outdoor market stall was not going to be more dangerous than going into Tesco's. As it happens, I think on fairly good medical advice, I think in those early days of the pandemic, the early strains, I don't think much passed through a respiratory route. So probably Tesco's was just as safe as the market stall as well.
Yeah.
But it seemed unfair. And I wrote an article for the Mail on Sunday saying, why can I buy a bunch of flowers in Tesco but not in my local market? And, I couldn't quite understand why people in government weren't looking for the obviously harmless things that could be done that would just restore some businesses to health, would restore some sense of normality for people. And I'm afraid the answer to that is that the advice that people were getting was partly driven by a desire to increase levels of anxiety so that people would accept very strict restrictions. And that's all in minutes of government advisory committees. But some people refused to pay attention to those things and didn't realise what was being done to them. But it was then in the summer, just shortly after the so-called Independence Day, the 4th of July, when the first lockdown ended, my own area was put into further restrictions, along with a few other places, a number of other places around the country. And I started to get very, very cross about that, because I looked at the borough of Trafford, where my constituency was, and we had lower levels of COVID than the neighbouring areas, which weren't in restriction. And I started to think, well, there's no actual scientific logic in this at all. There was an administrative logic that it was easier to say, we're going to put these restrictions on the whole of Greater Manchester, but if you're 100 yards over the boundary into Cheshire, that's fine. But there was no scientific logic to it. And then when we ultimately came out of those restrictions, we had low and falling COVID when we went into those restrictions. When we came out, and there was clearly no actual connection between what restrictions an area was under and whether COVID increased or not. And I think that the transmissibility of the virus, especially as it developed and mutated, became the key determinant. And so when we had Omicron, remember the absurdity of that, where, we must close the country. And the airports were all closed, no flights except the odd emergency flight. Well, I think it took 2 weeks for Omicron to become the prevailing strain of COVID in Britain after all of the travel routes were closed. So this is something you weren't going to be able to just keep out. And in many ways, it was a good thing, because Omicron was both more transmissible and less likely to kill people or cause serious illness. And that's what normally happens, thankfully, in the development and evolution of a virus. But turning to some of the other points you raised, the effect on young people, I thought it was appalling at the time that normally people go about saying, yes, we'll do anything for our children. Well, it's the next generation that counts, and it's opportunities for them. But actually, the country set about with very little regard for any negative effect that could be had on turning the lives of children or young people upside down. And the closure of schools for such an extended period of time was obviously going to have a very serious effect both on educational outcomes, especially for people who had fewer resources. The family with 3 or 4 kids in a tower block with no garden, no outside space. It must have been a really horrific time for people in those kind of circumstances. And the number of people going to university and finding that they were not having in any way a proper university experience, including obviously the complete absence for many people of any proper social contact through that time. And it was fairly obvious this was going to have serious effects on people's lives, in particular on mental health. And I think there is now a huge amount of evidence that mental health in the country as a whole has deteriorated, especially mental health amongst a lot of younger people. And that is a legacy that could be with us for a long time. It's one of the things that underpins the welfare problem of the massive increase in the number of people who are sitting at home, not working and not studying, and is going to have a very long-term effect on the public finances, very long-term effect on people's own lives. And obviously there'll be a lot of people who will suffer for many years into the future as a result of those things. So yeah, I was having those conversations as vigorously as I could with Boris Johnson, with other government ministers when it was possible, and in the chamber of the House of Commons. There were about 40 MPs who, out of 650, who insisted on turning up in person throughout. And from time to time, some people tried to make it sound as though we were doing something irresponsible and wrong. Actually, we were doing our duty and trying to make sure that government was held to account and couldn't carry on controlling people's lives in such an extreme way. But yeah, so I did at one point when I went to see Boris Johnson, I was particularly exercised that the government was going to introduce a 2-metre social distancing rule, which again had no basis whatsoever in medicine or science. But we'd had 1 metre and it didn't seem to work, so they were going to have 2 metres instead. And of course, the 2-metre rule made it completely impossible for schools to return. And also, my constituency, Ilford South West, right next door to Manchester Airport, had a lot of people who depended on aviation for their livelihoods. Completely impossible to run a commercial airline operation with a 2-metre social distancing rule. So I went to Boris to say, we needed to change this. It was going to be devastating for aviation, devastating for children who wouldn't be able to go to school. And he started off, first of all, with the kind of knee-jerk response that the champions of lockdown tended to use, which would be about, how many more people do you want to die? And I said, but I don't want people to die, but there's a reality. We need to have some balance, and we've got to have a chance for people to get back to doing some other things in their lives. And he said, well, well, perhaps this is meant to be. Perhaps this is our Black Death. And I said, but Boris, this isn't the Black Death. He said, no, you're right. The Black Death killed 40% of the population of Europe. This is killing hardly anyone. Whereupon the chief whip, who was in the room with us at the time, said to the Prime Minister, unless you're in your 90s. And which Boris said, no, you're wrong. Even if you're in your 90s, then you have 96% chance of surviving. So I had this odd experience that having gone in to argue a case against somebody who I thought was going to oppose me, he then adopted the position that I'd held at the start of the meeting and started telling me that actually my case was the correct one. Sadly, of course, it didn't lead to the reopening of schools or ending the social distancing requirement.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's no consolation to you, but as I say, you were proved right on all of those measurements that you'd set. And the thing I think eventually killed me off in terms of listening to the government's advice around the pandemic was eat out to help out. And then that very odd rule, you remember this, that if you went for a drink in a pub, you had to buy some food, and that somehow protected you from COVID. But there you go.
Scotch egg rule, yeah.
Oh, dear me. We eventually end up in a situation where Boris, I don't think any Prime Minister would have envied having to manage a pandemic, but he ends up, of course, getting himself the wrong side of the law he'd set himself, which was Partygate, and we don't need to go into the details of that. There were subsequently other things that actually caused him some difficulties, which are oft forgotten now, Graham. It wasn't the Partygate controversy that finished for him. It was other things that happened, but people will be able to read all about that in your book. I want to, because I'm conscious of time though, get on to Liz Truss and her short period in office, and just get your reflections on that time, because I'm not sure, having read some of the comments from Kingmaker, that you were ever convinced that she was likely to be a successful Prime Minister. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, it would. And I thought she had always just seemed a bit odd. And I said in the book, I'd found her a bit peculiar. And I suppose I was a bit surprised she'd become Foreign Secretary. And then when it looked like she was going to win the race to become party leader and Prime Minister, it wasn't the policy aspirations she was setting out. I think a lower tax, more lightly regulated economy done in the right way is more likely to grow and deliver the prosperity that we all want to see. So she was clearly pointing in the right direction. But then as that far too long leadership election went on over the summer months, the odd spectacle was one of Liz going about the country saying, we need lower taxes and regulation, and we're going to vibrant, exciting economy, i.e. what people want to hear. And Rishi was going around the country saying, yes, we want lower taxes and less regulation or a vibrant economy, but if you don't do it in the right way, then you cause some adverse market reactions, and unfunded tax cuts are not the way to go. Subtext being, and it's not what Margaret Thatcher did. Margaret Thatcher got a control of public expenditure and started then to make it possible to reduce taxes. The very early Thatcher was increasing taxes. The introduction of VAT, or increase of VAT right at the start. So Rishi was going about saying very sensible things, but not really what people wanted to hear, not something that's going to excite people. And I was watching effectively in real time. I was getting reports from the online ballot over the course of the summer of what the votes were for each candidate, which is not something we would normally do, but as I recount in the book, the Secret Intelligence Service had warned me as returning officer that there was some credible information suggesting that a hostile foreign actor might try to interfere in the leadership election. So it was one of the safeguards that we had, so that I'd be able to see if there was a sudden wild change or something unpredictable going on. But it did mean that I could see in real time what was going to happen. And it was very obvious that whilst Rishi narrowed the gap a little bit later in the campaign, Liz was always going to win it, and it was going to happen. So, I did again find myself announcing a winner in a Conservative leadership contest, and being slightly surprised as I said it.
And then, of course, within weeks, you're going back to speak to Liz Truss to tell her your time's up. What sort of conversation was that? Again, you talked about Theresa May obviously being upset, but eventually coming around to the idea that it was inevitable. Did Liz Truss take the news in the same sort of way?
No, not oddly. It was a very painless conversation for me, because I'd gone in to see the Prime Minister. I'd was picking up my phone to call, so I wanted to see the Prime Minister, and saw immediately I just had a message saying the Prime Minister would like to see. We arranged that I'm going to go in through the back gate next to St James's Park. I decided I'd avoid the media by getting the tube to St James's Park tube station, not Westminster. This all started to go slightly wrong as I walked past a coach that had parked at the roadside, and it was a coach party of young Chinese women students. And the first three who came off the coach recognised me and came and asked for selfies. And as I politely accepted their request and then made my excuses, I looked over my shoulder and could see the other 45 had formed a queue. So that went on. So tried to keep below the radar, wasn't going well. Went down, got in through the gate at the back of number 10, but was still photographed by one press photographer standing there in the rain. So they knew I was in there. I went in to see the Prime Minister. She said, Graham, I've got two questions for you. First, how bad do you think it is? And I said, well, I'm really sorry, but I think it's very bad. I agree. Second question, do you think it's retrievable? And I said, I'm really sorry, but my judgment, it isn't. And she said, I've come to the same conclusion. So there's no persuasion needed. And then I said, well, obviously you're going to make an announcement later. I either need a car to take me back over the road to the Palace of Westminster because I don't want to walk through the press pack of 200 or 300 in the road outside. Or I said, if you prefer, I'm happy to stay in this building until you've made your statement. We'll do that, Graham. We'll hold you hostage. So they found me a meeting room upstairs, or a spare office, telly, phone charger, get me a mug of tea and a tuna sandwich from the canteen. So I'm set up there watching the BBC rolling news. And after a while, I see the poor journalist there who's filling for all his worth, not knowing what the hell's going on, coming out with the wonderful line. So Graham Brady has now been in a meeting with the Prime Minister for 2.5 hours. The meeting has been joined by the Chief Whip, the Leader of the House of Commons, and the Conservative Party chairman, because I was sitting there with a tuna sandwich. Oddly, having immediately accepted when I went to see Liz that time was up, she moved in the other direction, in that a few months later, or was it, I suppose, a year and a bit later, at the Conservative Party conference, after the general election, she was going about telling the media that if only she was still Prime Minister, we would have won the election.
Yeah, and I think at that point we come back to almost the start of your parliamentary career, which was we go into a general election with the result almost, I think, set for probably months before. If you track the polls actually from Boris Johnson's time, it was clear that the Conservative support was dropping like a stone, actually. That being said, nobody anticipated the absolute trouncing that Rishi Sunak would take. And again, this is just a personal point of view. I actually felt sorry for Rishi Sunak, because he did inherit an absolute car crash, not just in terms of the damage Liz Truss had done to the economy, but I think party morale at that point must have been the lowest that you've seen it at for a long time, Graham, if not the very lowest.
Yeah, and I think it was both predictable that we were not going to win an election, although I didn't predict how bad the result would be, but also really quite unfair, in that I think that Rishi and Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor, they certainly did what was necessary in steadying the ship, restoring stability to the economy, getting inflation down. They had all the things moving in the right direction. They had us returning to growth as well. So they'd done a pretty good job. My criticism in the book, I'd say, is that they didn't take the political risks that would have been worth taking. Maybe some interesting changes, whether they be allowing new grammar schools, whether it be cutting inheritance tax, some things that would actually excite Conservatives and make them want to go out and vote Conservative. So I think they could have afforded to take some risks, because there was no point in not taking risks in that circumstance. But equally, I don't think they deserved the extraordinarily bad result they got. I have to say, on a sort of personal level, I think Jeremy Hunt then had a great sort of triumph in that he held his very marginal Surrey constituency against, I think, the Liberal Democrats. And I guess that was a suitable tribute from his own constituents saying, yeah, we've noticed you've done some good work here. But no, I think it's a very serious worry, the fact that the electorate has now become so volatile. And so we had 2019, Labour had the worst election result in its history. 2024, Labour comes back in with a majority of 160 odd, albeit on a very low percentage of the vote. And the Conservative Party has the worst results in its history. And not very long after an unimpressive Labour government has been in office and made a few mistakes in the budget and so on, you see the opinion polls suggesting that actually everybody is going to vote for a new party that doesn't seem to manage to hold on to its own MPs for more than a few months at a time. And I think as an elected politician, you should never criticise the electorate. Now, as an unelected politician, so I think people should consider quite carefully, which they may hate what a particular party has done or is doing in office, but actually a part of the answer to that is get involved in your preferred political party. Don't just flip from one to another and then to another and be disappointed every time.
Let me conclude, Graham, because I've kept you far longer than you will have anticipated, I'm sure. But I do want to get your thoughts on the future of British politics. And I'm very conscious of the point that you've just made. If you go and ask the great British public, do you think we should pay higher taxes? They say no. If you say to them, do they think they should spend more money on the health service? They say yes. Do you think welfare benefits should continue? That yes. Who's going to write the check, in a sense? But you've mentioned the inauspicious first year of the new Labour government, as you rightly point out, were elected with a loveless landslide, as it was described at the time. Kemi Badenoch, I would have to say to you, not being particularly impressive as the new leader of the Conservative Party, and the polling that the Tories have received actually dropped since the general election. And then we've had this surge from populists. Again, I've used the word a couple of times in this interview, inevitable. Are we heading to an inevitable general election victory for Nigel Farage and Reform in 4 years' time? Or could the mainstream parties still get their act together?
I don't think anything is inevitable in politics today. I think people are generally disillusioned, and that makes them inclined to move about, to try new things, and to move away from established parties that they think have often failed. It strikes me that what an awful lot of people really want, though, is real honesty and clarity and straight talking. And the gap in British politics now is for a genuinely fiscally responsible, fiscally conservative party, which is prepared to level with people about the true state of the public finances and what the necessary consequences of that are. We've just seen last week that the Labour Party is incapable of doing that. Labour leadership, I think, quite bravely decided to try to mitigate the problem with a set of measures that would not have reduced the welfare bill, it would have reduced the rate of increase of the welfare bill. We are running public sector debt at about 100% of GDP, but if you add in unfunded public sector pension schemes and other liabilities, it's probably more than double that in reality. There is a real limit to what government can borrow now. We already, quite outrageously, in my view, partly because of the vast amount of money spent on mitigating the COVID lockdowns. We've got public finances which are in a very difficult situation, even though we'd reached the point by the end of the last Parliament that taxes were heading for the highest level since the Second World War. You can't increase taxes because you are going to rub against that point where you put the tax up and you get less revenue. It's like the problem that is already evident of very wealthy people now leaving the United Kingdom, which costs us money and reduces the amount of tax that we get in. And all coming at the same time as this, it's pretty obvious to everyone now in a more dangerous world, we've got to spend much more money on our defence. Now, to do that, we're going to have to start spending less money. And that's just a reality which politicians can hide from, the public can choose not to engage with, but I think the public will respect the politicians who are prepared to have that conversation and are prepared to make it clear that we've got some genuinely difficult choices, which will include a very big reduction in the welfare bill, which has to be possible because if you look at the vastly greater number of people who are now on welfare benefits, especially people working age, than was the case 5, 10, 15 years ago, it's clear that we're just paying our benefits to a lot more.
Yeah.
So
just not.
I think there's room for somebody to get a grip. And I think the British people are in a place where they will be prepared to listen and accept that somebody's being straight with them rather than having some hidden agenda of trying to hurt people who need support.
Graham, on that note, and I think glass half full, there's still a chance for the Conservatives and Labour to basically reconnect with the British electorate and save us from populism. That's certainly the way I would see things. I'm sure you will too. But it's been fascinating to speak to you. I'd have liked to have got into your thoughts on post-Brexit and how you've felt that's gone, and lots of other things as well, including those parties and whether you were ever invited to number 10. But we won't. we ain't got time. We are hoping to get together in London with you for a lunch or a dinner. So we're just going to try and fix a date in the diary for that. But just remind people once more of that book, which is now out in paperback. Show us it again. That's Kingmaker.
Kingmaker. Out in hardback here, but now in paperback as well. And I also recorded the audio book myself. So I've had quite good reviews from my Boris Johnson and my David Cameron, admittedly not from Boris and David themselves.
It's a fabulous read. It's, as you say, got great reviews, and I'll have my copy with me for signing, if that's okay, when we do meet up in the capital. Graham, fabulous to see you once again. Look forward to catching up in the autumn.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Graham.